Leaf by Niggle by JRR Tolkien. There was once a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He didn't want to go, indeed the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he couldn't get out of it. He knew he'd have to make a start sometime, but he didn't hurry with his preparations. Niggle was a painter, not a very successful one, partly because he had many other things to do. Most of these things he thought were a nuisance, but he did them fairly well when he couldn't get out of them, which in his opinion was far too often. The laws in his country were rather strict. There were other hindrances too. For one thing, he was sometimes just idle, did nothing at all. For another, he was kind-hearted in a way. You know, the sort of kind heart made him uncomfortable more than it made him do anything, and even when he did anything, it didn't prevent him from grumbling, losing his temper, and swearing, mostly to himself. All the same, it did land him in a good many odd jobs for his neighbour, Mr. Parish, a man with a lame leg. Occasionally, he even helped other people from further off, if they came and asked him. Also, now and again, he remembered his journey and began to back a few things in an ineffectual way. Such times he didn't paint very much. He had a number of pictures on hand. Most of them were too large and ambitious for his skill. He was the sort of painter who can paint leaves better than trees. He used to spend a long time on a single leaf, trying to catch its shape, its sheen, and the glistening dewdrops on its edges. Yet he wanted to paint a whole tree, with all of its leaves, the same style, all of them different. There was one picture in particular which bothered him. It had begun with a leaf caught in the wind. It became a tree. The tree grew, sending out innumerable branches and thrusting out the most fantastic roots. Strange birds came and settled on the twigs and had to be attended to. And then all around the tree and behind it, through the gaps in the leaves and the boughs, the country began to open out. And there were glimpses of a forest marching over the land and of mountains tipped with snow. Niggle lost interest in his other pictures, whereas he could tuck them and tack them on the edges of this great picture. Soon the canvas became so large he had to get a ladder. He ran up and down it, putting in a touch here and rubbing out a branch there. When people came to call, he seemed polite enough, though he fiddled a little with the pencils on his desk. He listened to what they said, but underneath he was thinking all the time about his big canvas and the tall shed that had been built for it out in the garden, on a plot where once he had grown potatoes. He couldn't get rid of his kind heart. I wish I was more strong-minded, he sometimes said to himself, meaning that he wished other people's troubles didn't make him feel uncomfortable. But for a long time he was seriously perturbed. At any rate, I shall get this one picture done, my real picture, before I have to go on that wretched journey, he used to say. He was beginning to see that he couldn't put off this start indefinitely. The picture would have to stop just growing and get finished. One day Niggle thought a little way off from his picture, stood a little way off from his picture and considered it with unusual attention and detachment. He couldn't make up his mind what he thought about it, and wished he had some friend who would tell him what to think. Actually, it seemed to him wholly unsatisfactory, yet very lovely, and the only really beautiful picture in the world. What he would have liked at that moment would have been to see himself walk in, slap him on the back and say, obviously sincere, "Absolutely magnificent. I see exactly what you're getting at. Do get on with it. Don't bother about anything else. We'll arrange for a public pension so that you need not." However, there was no public pension. One thing he could see, it would need some concentration, some work, hard interrupted work to finish the picture, even of its present size. He rolled up his sleeves and began to concentrate. He tried for several days not to bother about other things, but there came a tremendous crop of interruptions. Things went wrong in the house. He had to go and serve on a jury in the town. A distant friend fell ill. Mr. Parrish was laid up with lumbago. Visitors kept on coming. It was springtime, and they wanted a free tea in the country. Niggle lived in a pleasant little house miles away from the town. He cursed them in his heart, but he couldn't deny that he had invited them himself, away back in the winter, when he had not thought an interruption to visit the shops and have tea with acquaintances in the town. He tried hard to harden his heart, but it was not a success. There were many things that he had not the face to say no to, whether he thought them duties or not, and there were some things he was compelled to do, whatever he thought. Some of his visitors hinted that the garden was rather neglected, and that he might get a visit from an inspector. Very few of them knew about his picture, of course, but if they had known, it would not have made any difference. I doubt if they would have thought that it mattered much. I dare say it was not really a very good picture, though it may have had some good passages. The tree, at any rate, was curious, quite unique in its way. So was Niggle. He was also very ordinary, and a rather silly little man. At length Niggle's time became really precious. His acquaintances in the distant town began to remember that little man had got to make a troublesome journey, and some began to calculate how long at the latest he could be putting off starting. They wondered who would take his house, and if the garden would be better kept. The autumn came, very wet and windy. The little painter was in his shed. He was up on the ladder, trying to catch the gleam of the westering sun and the peak of a snow mountain, which he glimpsed just to the left of the leafy tip of one of the trees. He knew he would have to be leaving soon, perhaps early next year. He could only just get the picture finished, and only so at that. There were some corners where he would not have time now to do more than hint at what he wanted.